everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. My name is Ken Mugrage. I'm one of your regular hosts. My guest today is Brandon Cook. Brandon, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, Brandon Cook. I've been at Thoughtworks for 13 years now. I am a principal technologist at Thoughtworks. I've also been playing the global practice lead for software development.
Great, thank you. So I imagine you've seen a few things happening in the last couple of years. For those that follow Thoughtworks, you may know that we recently published the 33rd edition of our technology radar. And one of the things that we were doing is our CTO, Rachel Laycock, actually posted a thing on Instagram. And behind her was a board that we call Too Complex to Blip. And so what that is, that's like people suggest things that we should put in the radar, but we really can't summarize them in one or two paragraphs. So we can't do the topic justice. And so we use those as potentials for podcasts and articles and other things. And Brandon saw that post on Instagram and reached out to me and said, hey, I have things to say there. And so we chatted and we thought, gosh, we should share those with you or the listening public. And so what we're going to go through is a few different topics here. So first off, Brandon, it's a loaded question, but the impact of generative AI on developer experience, right? That's pretty much all we talk about is generative AI these days, it seems like. But the truth is, it is touching every part of what we do. So, as a developer, how has the experience changed creating software the last couple of years?
Yeah, so I think everyone can feel the sort of transformative shift in how we're trying to approach software development while using things like coding agents and other applications of LLMs into the sort of software delivery lifecycle. So there is something there. I think a lot of people may have mixed opinions at the moment on what is actually feasible and what actually leads to the best outcomes. I think a lot of people are familiar with kind of the vibe coding term and being able to sort of just prompt your way towards an application. But at the end of the day, a lot of us in the software engineering side of the world understand that vibe coding aspect of it and just not caring about the code will only get you so far. So it's like very good for like rapid prototyping or experimenting with something or a small little toy application, but actually getting that into production where you have hundreds of thousands or millions of users is probably not the best approach. And so we're trying to find that good middle ground of being able to leverage coding agents to help accelerate the software development cycle, but then also still instill all those good practices into the coding agents as well. So still having a lot of the foundational practices that we would do during software development. So like things like TDD, test-driven development is an important aspect of the Thoughtworks sensible defaults. And the idea around using TDD to drive the design of the system, as well as when you're using coding agents, using TDD to drive and steer the coding agents towards the outcome that you're looking for. So it's really kind of working with the coding agents and focusing, not necessarily where you're vibe coding, where you're focusing on like the pure outcome, but also using the coding agents and focusing on the how. So embedding a lot of the sort of standard practices and good outputs and outcomes that you're looking for in terms of releasing high quality software that can be used by your end users.
So you used a term called sensible defaults, which is a term we use in Thoughtworks that actually, I think last time you were a guest on this podcast about 18 months ago, we were talking about that. And it's things like we do TDD by default. And for us, a sensible default, for the people that didn't hear that podcast, means that this is really the way you should do it unless you have a good reason not to. We don't believe in the term like best practices. There's no single best. That said, I know internally we've had a lot of conversations about the maturity of some of these practices in this area that we're not ready to publish sensible defaults yet. Is that getting closer, or what are some of the things, even if they're not ready to codify them quite yet? What are some of the sensible defaults, if you will, that developers should be looking at in this area?
Before I get into, I guess, what we're seeing as emerging sensible defaults for like AI first software delivery and coding agents, I'll like to like reiterate that a lot of the sensible defaults we've already have, like the foundational practices, are essentially amplified by leveraging these tool sets. So if you're already doing sort of frequent and continuous integration, right, you're in a better spot than someone who has kind of long lived branches and long code review and PR times, because at this point you're only going to accelerate the amount of code that you're going to be like outputting, because these coding agents are very good at generating larger code sets. And you can even see in a lot of the recent studies, I think there's a Get Clear study, as well as the latest sort of Dora AI AI development report, that we're already seeing an uptick in PR sizes and code sizes as the introduction of coding agents has come into play. So if you're already having a struggle getting through the review cycle, integrating code, dealing with merge conflicts, it's better to shore up that practice prior to adopting coding agents and then start building that into your system. So that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of our sensible defaults across the board being more important. So it's almost like validating that, okay, these practices that were good for developers without coding agents are also going to be important for coding agents as well. Another aspect of like where we're seeing kind of emerging sensible defaults is a lot of the coding agents are kind of converging on some standards and practices. So if you look at the agents MD files, you'll see most coding agents and tools basically out of the box will say, yeah, create this, sort of instill the context and expertise that you provide for your standards and practices, so that the agent will follow those practices while doing development, and ensuring that you're also basically instilling some of the software engineering craft and practices into the development for the agent, and then that you're making sure that you're bringing your expertise to the agent, and it's not just you're going back and forth between the agent and yourself without like actually providing a lot of the context that can lead to a better outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of the hit that continuous delivery did. Gosh, what is it, 15 or 16 years ago now? Where a lot of us would say, if you're creating junk, this is just going to let you create faster junk. We didn't always say junk, but that's what I'll say on the public podcast. And so I get what you're saying, that, yeah, it's the engineering practices are still maybe even more important now. So you also mentioned, like, of course, the air quotes vibe coding term, and I'm actually publishing an article today or tomorrow about how the ability to do that style of coding has actually brought me closer to code than I've been in many years. I was a professional developer, but it's been a while, and so I don't prototype anymore or that sort of thing. But I started to. And it was really good for fleshing out the ideas and then sharing it with people who had the right development experience. But one of the things that I also experienced during that, we talk about, the team practices and team structures, is I was using a tool, and when one of my colleagues came by and they're like, "Why are you using that tool? That's what we were using a year ago. But that's not anywhere close to best of breed anymore. And you should be using this other one." So, I mean, how do you deal with that? Everything's moving really quickly. Sometimes there are real substantial differences. And there was. I switched tools, and I'm not going to name names because this is going to be different next month than it is today, right? But I switched to a different tool, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so much better. But how do you draw that line when you're managing a team? I mean, if you're always updating your tools, you're never writing your product, right? So what's that look like?
So yeah, I think right now with the breakneck pace of the industry, there is a challenge to sort of continuing to know when to move on to a new tool, or whether to sort of keep adapting to the current tool that you're using, as well as just sort of understand what are kind of the foundational ways of leveraging these tools in the right way. Because even if you look at particular tools like Cloud Code, for instance, they'll have like commands and sub agents and skills and MCP servers and like all these new ways of collaborating with agents or building agentic systems are coming out on a weekly basis, and it's hard to keep up. But at the end of the day, it's really sort of figuring out how do you manage that context, and how do you provide the right context to the agent without giving it too much information where now it's got sort of context rot and it can't really drive to the outcome that you're looking for. When is it time to sort of clear out a session and restart? How do you start like adding proper memory or proper expertise to an agent at the right point in time to give you the right outcomes that you're looking for? So I think there are some foundational practices that are emerging there, even though there's a bunch of new ways of doing it depending on the tools that you're using. But those are kind of like the foundational practices that are emerging with like how to use these tools. So whether you're using a new mechanism for managing context by some other tool that comes out next week, having that understanding of when to use that and when to maybe use the old mechanism that still can be valid in some outputs, is going to be important. So basically, at the end of the day, it's like how software engineering has always been, sort of being adaptable and flexible. Not everything's a silver bullet, right? Trying to decide what pattern to use at what point in time for the use case is probably the most important aspect of it.
Yeah, I know one of our colleagues often says that AI is good at making experts better and beginners worse. That's it. Like silly example. The baseball playoffs in the United States were recent, and I was a little chippy Sunday morning as a Seattle native, and our Mariners got kicked out in the championship series. But I asked for a correlation between payrolls and where they finished. And it gave me that correlation, except for that it was wrong on 80% of where the teams finished. Had the wrong teams in the World Series, et cetera. And so it was just wrong. And had I not known that, I could have published that. And so, if we think of from a code perspective, I mean, is your IDE a pairing partner now? Or is it, where does it sit in the team? What's its role in the team?
When we're talking about pairing, I think people like to see it as a replacement for pair programming, but I don't think it's a replacement for pair programming for a variety of reasons. One, like the main reason for pair programming isn't just, right, like productivity increases or anything of that nature, right? It's really about the need for collaboration as a team, as well as sort of spreading ownership of the system across the team, right? So I think even when we're using these coding agents and developing with them and they're outputting a ton of code or generating a lot of different changes, at the end of the day, the ownership is still going to reside on the team. We haven't reached a point where the agency of these coding agents is where they're going to have full ownership of the code. Who knows when that's going to happen, but it's clearly not in this day and time that that's occurring. So it's even more important to make sure that we're pairing and we're disseminating knowledge so that the whole team has ownership of the system and not just siloed with maybe just one developer or even just within that session of the coding agent, right? Right. So we definitely need to have ownership. Another aspect that I'm starting to see is like you were saying, Ken, around it's really like coding agents being really good with experts, but difficult for juniors. I'm seeing trying to work through ways of how do we have coding agents where pairing sessions with coding agents as like a trio, where maybe you have more senior engineers working with more junior engineers to sort of cultivate the craft and expertise with those junior engineers, but also the junior engineers tend to have more innovative ways of using these tools that the senior engineers don't, right? So it's almost a good synergy of the senior engineers knows where like kind of the bodies are buried in terms of gotchas and different systems and designing systems. And they can bring that expertise and instill that with the junior engineer. But then the junior engineer has sort of innovative ways of using these tools and agentic systems because they are kind of growing up with it. And that's just their way of development. So marrying the two can lead to some interesting outcomes. And we're sort of starting to see that on the ground. But we're trying to instill that more into our practices on the variety of our teams today.
As we sit here in November of 25, in case people are listening to this later, if we think about, you mentioned agents and agentic. If we say, and I realize that there's a million things out there, a million definitions, but if we say part of the definition of agentic is autonomy, right? Autonomous actions. Are we close at all? Is there an agentic development architecture? Is there an area of the code, an area of the testing, deployment, whatever, where we can trust autonomous agents? And if so, how do we get there?
Yeah, I think right now my mental model is kind of, there's like an autonomy slider almost of how much autonomy do I want to give the agent? So it's not just autonomy, but it's like, what scope of the problem am I doing? What's the risk that comes into play into the problem I'm trying to solve? Also, what's the novelty of the problem I'm trying to solve? Because at the end of the day, like most of the coding agents are essentially trained on sort of what's been done mostly on the internet in terms of like code bases like this. So it's like, what are the sort of normal things that have been done on the internet? So I think it's really great at sort of accelerating any boilerplate things or things that are sort of simple, that have been done before, that are repeatable. So giving it more autonomy in those tasks, but then sort of saying, okay, is this a high risk area? Like probably giving less autonomy, making sure there's more feedback loops between the developer and the agent in that area, or maybe even just, if it's so novel and so risky, moving back that autonomy and kind of just going back to leveraging like the autocomplete features of these agents, right? Like the autocompletes is where we all started. So it's almost just kind of like a slider knob depending on the situation and sort of determining like how much risk is involved, the novelty, as well as how much autonomy do I really feel like will lead to the best outcome in this agent, and how much ownership should I have over this piece of the code base.
Yeah. So something you kind of touched on a little bit there, at least what I took from it. If we look at the large language, especially the commercial large language models, they're trained on public code. They're trained on what they can find in the open, which is sometimes, I mean, I come from an open source background, sometimes very, very good, and sometimes not. And so are there any guidelines? And I don't have any clue. Are there any guidelines for whether it be choosing your model or the various techniques you can use to limit what your AI can look at? Are there any accepted practices now for saying don't look at the garbage code?
There's kind of an emerging practice of basically essentially setting a pattern in the code base. Like I said, I'm going to do the autonomy slider, right? So maybe if I'm just initially setting a pattern in my code base, that's where maybe the autonomy slider goes down, and us as a team need to set that pattern. And once the pattern is set, you can kind of turn the knob back up if you want to like repeat that pattern somewhere else in the code base, because that's what these agents are very good at, right? They're very good at taking what's in the code base, understanding it, and then being like, okay, this is the guardrail that I have. This is the pattern that's been set in the system, and now I can repeat that elsewhere. So it's very much what I've seen performed well in the past, where maybe you have like an architect or a lead set a pattern in the code base, and then the team goes off and runs with it. Now it's even more important to do that with coding agents, setting that foundational pattern in the system, and then having that be repeatable and accelerated by a coding agent.
So like when we talk about, again, it's kind of the autonomy versus human oversight, we're never going to give the AI a pager, right? And so what do we do to make sure that our operations people know how this is architected and how it's being run? So this is always a complaint we have with continuous delivery, right? Is that, oh, this just gives our development teams the ability to push faster junk, which is where the whole DevOps movement came in and trying to mix them together. And so, I mean, where's that slider at? How do we know that the support people know what the latest feature does and how to troubleshoot it? And how do you share that knowledge organizationally if some of the code's being created by someone who doesn't have a pager?
Another aspect that where these, like, I kind of think about it this way, like the coding agents are kind of staff level at understanding the code base. So that's where it's like very good at, okay, this is what I've outputted, almost being able to sort of create documentation on the fly. I know a lot of us struggled to create a lot of documentation or understanding how the system works, like after the fact, so that people didn't have to go into the code base and start navigating and really understand the system. So almost being able to document the outputs of that session that day or the code base that day into something that could be used by operations teams and SRE teams and potentially even other agents that need that documentation for support or things of that nature, right? Can be accelerated by using coding agents. So it's almost like this loop of set the initial pattern, have the coding agent sort of repeat that pattern, then also use the coding agent to then document a lot of the outputs of the work that's been done so that they can then be set into sort of the knowledge base of the organization or the developer journey, so that either other agents can leverage that documentation or leverage that public knowledge base to then future help other folks down the line, help with different decision making, whether it's issues that have arose in the system or we're trying to change the system for a new feature set. So a lot of kind of that sort of developer journey is definitely getting shifted at the moment. Now, not to say like that flow is perfect today, but that's where a lot of the agentic systems and a lot of the area is ripe for experimentation and ripe for disruption to sort of help accelerate a lot of that flow.
So if we think about the full team being a cross-functional team, right? Everybody from, I think it was John Willis that said, from idea to cha-ching. How has AI, or has it as a developer, changed the way you get your inputs and outputs, like how you get requirements, how you understand what needs to be built, verifying that you built the right thing? Has that changed at all, the inputs and outputs, or is that still just people on a table?
I think it's definitely changed significantly, because I think people aren't starting with that blank slate anymore, right? So usually maybe was gathering requirements, starting off with a blank slate. I think so, a lot of people who may be more AI forward are leveraging like agents or LLMs as another source or another participant in the requirements gathering or the requirements formatting or the ideation, right? So I think it's almost as another participant. A pattern I like to use is just making sure that it is just purely another participant, right? So almost just doing the same ways of ideation or requirements gathering that you were before, and then sort of validating and using it as a way to critique those requirements to see if there's any edge cases or gaps that have come into play, because then that can help combat some of the sort of complacency that you may see if you're just getting the raw output from the LLM and just using that as is because, it looks good, it's probably good enough. And that's where you probably don't want to go too far in that direction, because you still probably want ownership over those requirements, ownership over the gathering, ownership over the decision making, but really sort of leveraging the LLM as a collaborator to sort of identify gaps, critique any sort of vague requirements, as well as just help make improvements overall.
So how is the architecture itself evolving to support these? I know you've done a little bit of talk about durable computing and related topics. So, I mean, looking forward, is the architecture evolving? What's that look like?
Architecture is definitely evolving, but I would say it's almost like like is the emperor in new clothes type thing, where a lot of architecture patterns and practices that we were writing in normal systems, right? They can just like without AI are just kind of being repeated and instilled with agentic systems as well. So like if we're talking about like like doing context engineering and managing context in an agentic system, right? And we want to have particular specialized agent here. And if you're talking about like a multi-agent system, having a specialized agent focused in one area and another specialized agent focused in another area, and you have an orchestrator agent that kind of sort of organizes everything together. That to me almost just seems very familiar to how we try to design a lot of our systems, whether they'd be distributed or whether they'd be in more of a monolith, like where we try to make the modularization and sort of have that separation of concerns and then maybe orchestrate the system together based off those differences. So it's a lot of those similar practices just being applied on with AIs and LLMs nowadays. So if you look at a lot of these durable computing platforms that kind of built in a lot of the resiliency around distributed systems, they're kind of sort of leaning in to say, okay, you can do all your orchestration for your agents with our durable computing platform. So you're resilient to failures and you can do retries if you can't access an agent for whatever reason or an agent fails, right? So it's sort of trying to apply a lot of these like older practices with this sort of new flavor of managing context and building out different agents and sort of trying to basically lead to better outcomes with agentic systems. So it's a lot of what is old is new kind of feeling for me at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a theme there, right? Like the engineering practices still matter. What old is new, et cetera. So that maybe I just kind of biased this question, but just in conclusion, I guess if people take away one thing, if you could teach the world one thing about software development with generative AI, what's the important takeaway?
Yeah, I guess the TLDR, a lot of the things I've said today are, yes, we are in a very transformative time where it's like good to stay abreast of all the new tools, all the new patterns and techniques, but then really sort of understanding, okay, what are the foundational patterns behind them? And am I doing those correctly? And if you're doing those correctly, if you've got the expertise within your teams, right, that's where you can start leveraging these AIs and coding agents as a way to amplify those practices and amplify those across your system, right? If I don't have those and I'm just trying to tack it on to a given workflow, that's where we're going to see all these. Like if you probably read, you probably like see like, oh, most AI projects fail. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm not surprised because like most software projects tend to fail as well. So it's like, if you're missing some of these foundational practices and you're just trying to tack on AI to it, that's not the approach you want to take, right? You really want to take some of those foundational kind of first principles approach to it and really saying, okay, how can I use this to augment my system once I have those foundational practices in place?
Great. Well, I want to thank you very much for your time. It's always interesting to hear what's going on in the real world.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Ken.